you lost the job, or the marriage ended without warning, or you watched people who used to ask you for advice pull so far ahead that you no longer recognize the distance between you, and somewhere in that wreckage, someone told you to heal, to be patient, to trust the timing. That advice is not wrong. It is also not enough. And if you have followed it for months with nothing to show for it, you already know that. Here is what nobody tells you. In 1512, a man named Niccolò Machiavelli lost everything a person can lose without losing his life. He was stripped of his office, fined into bankruptcy, imprisoned, tortured on the rack for a conspiracy he had nothing to do with, then exiled to a small, failing farm south of Florence, at 44 years old, with no career, no income, and no path back into the world that had defined him for 14 years. He did not heal quietly. He did not wait for the timing to feel right. Within months, working by candlelight, after full days of manual labor, he wrote The Prince, the single most influential book on power ever produced by a broken man. This is not a video about revenge. It is not about becoming ruthless for the sake of it. What Machiavelli left behind is colder and more useful than that. It is a set of mechanics for what to do with a life once it has already been taken apart. And the first mechanic starts with a test you can run on yourself in under 10 seconds, using nothing but the difference between a fact and a label. Picture a man who takes a wrong turn on a long drive. He ends up somewhere he did not intend to be, hours from where he meant to go. He does not get out of the car and set it on fire. He does not decide the vehicle is broken because the route was wrong. He turns it around. The car was never the problem. The direction was. Most people, after a collapse, do the opposite. They do not say, I lost the job. They say, I am a failure. They do not say the relationship ended. They say, I am someone who cannot be loved for long. One of those statements is a fact. It describes something that happened once in the past and is now closed. The other is a label. It describes a permanent category of person, applied to the self, extended indefinitely into the future. The fact is data. The label is a life sentence you wrote for yourself, and then forgot you were the author of. Clinical psychology has a name for the tool that separates the two. It is called cognitive diffusion, and it comes out of a therapeutic approach known as acceptance and commitment therapy. The technique is almost embarrassingly simple. Instead of saying, I am a failure, you say, I am having the thought that I am a failure. That is the entire intervention. And the reason it works is not magic, it is structural. The first sentence fuses you to the thought completely, so that attacking the thought feels like attacking yourself. The second sentence creates 1 inch of space between you and the thought, and in psychology, 1 inch is often the entire distance between paralysis and movement. Machiavelli ran a version of this test without a clinical vocabulary for it. Florence called him a traitor, a conspirator, a disgraced former official with no future in public life. Those were labels, delivered by people with every incentive to make them permanent. He did not argue with the labels in public, and he did not privately accept them either. He simply kept operating as what he actually was underneath the label. A strategist, a diplomat by training, a man who understood how power moved through rooms he could no longer enter. He had no office. He kept the skill. The fact was that his position was gone. The label everyone wanted him to wear was that he was finished. He rejected the label and kept the car. There is a second layer to this, one that Machiavelli could not have named, but lived out anyway. The psychologist Albert Bandura spent decades studying what he called self-efficacy, the belief a person holds about whether their own effort can actually produce a result. His research found something specific. People with high self-efficacy do not experience fewer failures than anyone else. They experience the same failures everyone does. What differs is the sentence that follows the failure inside their own head. Low self-efficacy converts a single event into a verdict on the person's basic capability. High self-efficacy converts the same event into a data point about one attempt, under one set of conditions that can be adjusted. Machiavelli's letters from exile are full of specific, almost clinical complaints about his circumstances, the poverty, the boredom, the indignity of the local inn. What they are not full of is language suggesting he believed himself permanently incapable. He treated the disaster as information about his position, not a verdict on his competence. This is worth sitting with, because most people run the test backwards without noticing. They audit the label with total confidence and treat the fact as if it was still up for debate. They will tell you, in detail, exactly what kind of person they apparently are now. Unlovable, unemployable, behind, finished. But ask them for the actual fact underneath it, the specific event, the date, the decision, the thing that can be pointed to and examined, and the story gets vague fast. The label was rehearsed until it sounded like truth. The fact was barely looked at. Reverse that order. Interrogate the label like it is a hostile witness, and treat the fact with the plain, boring respect it deserves as one closed event in the past. But separating fact from label only gets you so far, because it still leaves the wreckage sitting there, and wreckage does not clean itself up through reframing alone. Sometimes what looks like destruction is not damage, it is pruning. And to understand why the collapse itself might have been necessary, you have to look at what happened to the men Cesare Borgia decided he no longer needed. In the winter of 1502, Cesare Borgia was consolidating control over the Romagna and 4 of his own condottieri. The mercenary captains who had helped him take the region had grown unreliable. They were plotting against him. Borgia did not confront them, negotiate with them, or slowly phase them out. He lured them to the town of Senigallia under the appearance of reconciliation and had them eliminated in a single, coordinated night. Machiavelli witnessed the aftermath directly, as a Florentine envoy present in the region, and wrote about it with something close to professional admiration. What Borgia understood, and what Machiavelli absorbed from watching him, is that unreliable structure does not improve with patience. It has to be removed cleanly before it can do more damage from the inside. Apply that same logic inward, and ego death stops being a spiritual metaphor and becomes a maintenance operation. The identity you built around a job title, a relationship, a social circle, a version of yourself that other people relied on, that identity was a structure. Sometimes it was a good one. But when it collapses, the honest question is not always, how do I rebuild exactly what I had? Sometimes the honest question is whether that structure was already unreliable, already costing you more than it returned, already something you would have had to dismantle eventually. Machiavelli's own diplomatic identity, the 14 years of missions and negotiations that made him who he was in Florence, did not survive the Medici's return. He did not spend his exile trying to reconstruct that exact self. He let it die, and something more dangerous grew in the space it left behind. Here is the part people skip past. They mourn the branch. They stand under the tree pointing at what the storm took, listing every leaf, every limb, cataloguing the exact shape of the loss down to the day. And while they are counting the wreckage on the ground, they miss the detail that actually matters, which is that the tree is still alive. A storm does not select branches at random. It snaps the rigid ones, the ones that could not bend, the ones already weak at the joint. What survives a storm was, structurally, always going to survive it. The branches that came down were coming down eventually. The storm just moved the timeline. Researchers who study trauma have a more formal name for the far side of this process. They call it post-traumatic growth, and it is a distinct category from simple recovery. Recovery means returning to where you were before the damage. Growth means the disruption itself becomes the mechanism that produces a structural change you would not have reached by staying comfortable. The research is specific about why this happens. A person's assumptions about their own life, their competence, their permanence, their control, tend to calcify over time if nothing forces a re-examination. Destruction forces the re-examination. It is not that the pain is good. It is that the pain is sometimes the only event large enough to make someone rebuild the foundation instead of just repainting the walls. So, if Machiavelli's example teaches anything at this stage, it is that clearing unreliable structure, whether it is external allies or an internal identity, is not damage. It is what has to happen before anything new can be load-bearing. But clearing the structure is only step one, because once it is gone, something has to be in control of what gets built next. And that is where most people fail. Not because they lack a plan, but because they hand the decision-making over to exactly the wrong part of themselves. Right after a collapse, there is a version of you that wants to send the angry text. Post the bitter update. Confront the person who wronged you at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible tone, for the worst possible reason, which is simply that the feeling is loud and it wants to be obeyed. Call that version of you the monkey. It is reactive, fast, emotionally loud, and completely uninterested in consequences past the next 10 minutes. It is not evil. It evolved to keep you alive in immediate danger, but it was never designed to drive. Sovereignty, in the strict sense Machiavelli operated by, is not the absence of emotion. He was not a stone. Contemporary accounts describe a man who felt his losses sharply, who wrote to friends about bitterness, poverty, and humiliation in language that is anything but detached. The discipline was not suppression. It was refusing to let the emotional state make decisions on his behalf. Modern research on emotion regulation backs this distinction precisely. Studies using cognitive reappraisal, the technique of consciously reinterpreting the meaning of a difficult event rather than suppressing the reaction to it, show measurable neural differences between people who successfully regulate this way and people who do not. The emotion is not eliminated. It is prevented from taking the wheel. There is a reason this distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A person who suppresses emotion is spending energy holding a door shut. A person who reappraises emotion has changed what is on the other side of the door in the first place. The first strategy is exhausting and eventually fails, because you cannot hold a door indefinitely. The second strategy is sustainable, because the threat has actually been reinterpreted rather than merely blocked. This is the functional difference between a person who white-knuckles their way through a bad year and a person who metabolizes it. One of them is running out of strength on a fixed timer. The other is not fighting the same battle twice. Machiavelli built a literal ritual around this separation, and it is one of the strangest, most disciplined details of his exile. He described it himself in a letter. His days at San Castiano were undignified by his own account. Manual labor on the farm, petty arguments in the village, long, aimless hours playing backgammon and cards at the local inn, often losing money he did not have, surrounded by, in his own words, lice. That was the daytime self, and he let it be exactly as undignified as it was. But in the evening he returned home, and before entering his study he changed his clothes. He removed the mud and dust of the day, and put on what he called his court dress, the formal clothing of the diplomatic life that no longer officially existed for him. Only then did he sit down to write. The ritual was not decoration. It was a hard boundary between the reactive, humiliated man who existed during the day and the composed strategist who was allowed to exist for 4 hours each night. He said so directly. For 4 hours, I forget all my worries. I am afraid neither of poverty nor of death. The monkey got the daylight. The strategist got the desk. That kind of composure sounds like a purely internal discipline, something you generate through will alone, and that is precisely the myth that causes most comeback attempts to fail within a few weeks. Composure is not free. It is expensive, and willpower alone cannot pay for it indefinitely, which is why the next piece of this is not psychological at all. It is physical. Here is the uncomfortable audit most people skip. You can plant the highest quality seed available, genetically optimal, full of potential, and if you put it in soil that has been poisoned and starved of sunlight, it will not grow, no matter how much you believe in the seed. This is not the generic advice to protect your environment that gets repeated in every productivity video until it means nothing. This is narrower and colder than that. It is a one-time, brutal audit of exactly what and who currently has access to you. Done once with total honesty, rather than something you try to will yourself into managing fresh every single day. Machiavelli did not perform his composure inside Florence. He performed it 7 miles outside it, physically removed from the political theater that had destroyed him, away from the people who would have kept pulling him back into old arguments, old grievances, old versions of the fight he had already lost. That physical distance was not incidental to the writing of The Prince. It was a precondition for it, proximity to the old arena, the same streets, the same rivals, the same daily reminders of exactly what had been taken from him, would have kept the monkey in the driver's seat permanently. He removed himself from the soil that was poisoning the seed before he ever tried to make the seed grow. Most people get this exactly backwards. They set a new goal, a new habit, a new version of themselves they want to become, and they try to build it inside the identical environment that produced the collapse in the first place. Same group chat, same daily scroll through the life of the person who replaced them. Same physical desk where the bad news arrived. Then they wonder why willpower runs out by week 3. It runs out because willpower was never supposed to be the thing doing the work. The environment was supposed to do it, quietly, in the background, without requiring a single ounce of daily motivation. The audit itself is not complicated. It is just uncomfortable, which is why almost nobody actually runs it. It asks 3 blunt questions. Who currently has daily access to your attention, and did they earn that access, or simply inherit it by proximity? What information reaches you automatically, without your consent, every time you open a screen? And what is it doing to your baseline emotional state before you have even chosen a single thought of your own, and which physical spaces are saturated with the memory of the collapse so thoroughly that simply occupying them puts you back in the emotional posture of the worst day, regardless of what you are trying to think about. Machiavelli's answer to that third question was geographic. He left. Your answer does not have to be that dramatic, but it has to be equally honest, because a seed planted in the same poisoned soil with a slightly more positive attitude is still a seed planted in poisoned soil. If the distinction in that first section between the fact of what happened to you and the label you have been wearing since has already started to loosen something, that is worth marking right now, before the next section moves on, so you can find this exact moment again later instead of losing it in the scroll. Once the environment stops working against you, a new problem shows up, and it is quieter than the last one, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. It is the pull toward visible progress, the comeback everyone can see, the applause that tells you the rebuild is working, and that pull, more than almost anything else in this entire process, is what kills the rebuild before it finishes. Picture two trees planted on the same day. One is a fast-growing species, the kind that shoots upward in its first year, visibly taller by the season, the neighbor everyone points at and admires. Its root system stays shallow because the tree is spending its energy on height instead of depth. The other tree grows almost nothing you can see for years. Underneath the soil, though, it is doing something the fast tree never did. It is sending roots down, wide and deep, anchoring itself against exactly the kind of storm that already took you down once. Then a real storm arrives, the kind that eventually arrives for everyone, and the fast, visible, admired tree goes over in an afternoon. The slow one is still standing a century later. Public validation is the fast tree. It feels like progress because it is immediate, visible, and socially confirmed. Someone likes the post. Someone notices the comeback. Someone says you look like you're doing great. And there is research explaining exactly why that feeling is so addictive and so structurally weak. Studies on social approval show that positive evaluation from others activates the brain's reward circuitry, the same dopamine-driven pathway involved in other reinforcing behaviors, and that the stronger a person's neural response to that approval, the more their motivation to keep chasing it increases. It is not a metaphor to say public validation can function like a drug. It is a description of the actual mechanism, and like most mechanisms built for a quick hit, it does not build root depth. It builds height. The prince, the book Machiavelli, wrote in the depth of his most humiliating years, received none of the immediate validation the fast tree gets. It was not published in his lifetime. When it finally did circulate and eventually print, decades after his death, it was condemned by the church, denounced by critics across Europe, and used for centuries afterward as shorthand for everything sinister about political ambition. Machiavelli never lived to see a single reader recognize what he had actually built. He wrote the deepest root system of his life while receiving zero public confirmation that any of it mattered. The tree only became visible long after the man who planted it was gone, and it is still standing 500 years later, outlasting nearly every contemporary who was more visibly successful than he was in 1513. This is the part worth sitting with on its own. Almost everyone rebuilding after collapse wants proof the rebuild is working, and they want it on a timeline that has nothing to do with when the proof would actually be available. They check for it daily. They measure their worth against how convinced other people look. And the entire time, the actual structural work, the kind that would make the next storm survivable, gets starved of the only resource it needed, which was unglamorous, unwitnessed time. There is a specific trap hidden inside this that deserves naming directly, because it does not look like weakness from the inside. It looks like ambition. The person chasing visible proof usually believes they are being efficient, moving fast, refusing to waste time on anything that will not show results. What they are actually doing is optimizing for the metric that is easiest to see rather than the one that is actually load-bearing. Height is easy to measure. Anyone walking past the tree can eyeball it. Root depth is invisible by design, and a species that could be observed and admired for its root system would have evolved to advertise it. The same way, flowers evolved color specifically because it gets noticed. Nothing about deep compounding work is built to be noticed while it is happening. That is not a flaw in the process. It is close to the entire point. The invisibility is what allows the depth to happen undisturbed, free from the distortion that comes the moment. Something becomes an audience metric instead of a private discipline. And this is where most rebuilds quietly leak the energy they need. It leaks out through other people's requests. None of that depth is free, though. And this is where most rebuilds quietly leak the energy they need. It leaks out through other people's requests. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being reachable at all times, agreeable by default, available to absorb whatever anyone else needs from you, especially in the aftermath of a collapse, when there is a strong pull to prove you are still useful, still likable, still worth keeping around. Research on people-pleasing behavior is specific about the cost. It is associated with lower self-worth, higher anxiety, and a persistent sense that your value is conditional on how much you accommodate, and the underlying fear driving all of it. The fear of what happens if you actually say no turns out to be largely manufactured. Researchers studying declined invitations found that people consistently overestimate how upset others will be when they hear no. Across 5 separate studies, the imagined damage was significantly larger than the real social cost. The fear is doing enormous work. The evidence backing the fear is almost non-existent. Machiavelli's writing on this, translated into the register of an individual life rather than a state, is blunt to the point of discomfort. A ruler who is loved unconditionally and constantly available to everyone eventually has no real authority left, because authority requires the capacity to disappoint people and survive it. Constant availability is not generosity. It is often just fear wearing generosity's clothing. The fear that if you are not endlessly useful, you will be discarded the way you already were once. Absolute strategic self-preservation looks colder from the outside. It is not. It is what allows the deep root system from the last section to actually finish growing, instead of being interrupted every time someone else needs something from you first. There is a strange irony buried in how people respond to boundaries, and it is worth naming directly. The version of you that says yes to everything, that stays reachable at every hour, that never risks disappointing anyone, is not actually the version of you people respect most. It is usually the version they rely on most and think about least, precisely because reliability with no boundary attached costs nothing to take for granted. The moment a boundary appears, something shifts, not always comfortably, not always immediately, but it shifts. Watch what actually happens the first time someone hears no from a person who has never said it before. There is a brief silence, sometimes irritation. And then, more often than the fear predicted, a recalibration. Because the other person is updating their model of you in real time. Learning that your availability has a flaw under it after all. People do not generally respect what costs them nothing to access. They respect what has a price, even a small one, because a price implies the thing being protected has value worth protecting. A boundary is not a wall built to keep people out. It is a price tag, and it tells everyone around you, including yourself, that what is behind it is worth something. None of this, the identity work, the pruning, the composure, the environment, the patience, the boundaries, means anything without a fixed point to aim all of it at. And that fixed point is the part almost nobody sets with any real specificity. Picture a ship crossing open ocean toward a single set of coordinates. A storm hits. The ship gets pushed off course for 2 days, 3 days, maybe a full week, thrown far from where it intended to be. A poorly captained vessel treats the detour as a new destination. It stops correcting, drifts wherever the current happens to be moving, and eventually loses any memory of where it was originally headed. A well-captained vessel does something different. It logs the storm as exactly what it was, a temporary deviation, and the instant conditions allow it, it corrects back toward the original coordinates. The storm did not change the destination. It only ever changed the route. Machiavelli's coordinates were never the diplomatic career he lost in 1512. That was one route toward relevance, and it was gone. But the underlying target, to understand and articulate how power actually functions, independent of moral comfort, independent of who was currently in charge in Florence, never moved. In the years after the prince, exiled and mostly unemployed, he kept working the same coordinates from a completely different angle. He wrote the Discourses on Livy, an extended study of republican government drawn from Roman history. He wrote The Art of War, a formal treatise on military organization, the only major work he saw published in his own lifetime. He was eventually asked, years later, to write a history of Florence for the very Medici family that had tortured him. He did not refuse out of pride. He took the assignment because the target was never about which family signed his commissions. It was about the coordinates themselves, understanding power, on paper, permanently, regardless of which route got him there. That is the discipline underneath everything in this video, not the absence of a detour, because there is no version of a real life that avoids every storm. The discipline is refusing to let the detour quietly become the new coordinates, simply because correcting course is harder than drifting. Notice what the coordinates were not. They were not a mood. They were not a feeling of being back on top, some vague sense of having proven something to the people who wrote him off. A feeling cannot function as a coordinate, because a feeling has no fixed location. It moves depending on the day, the weather, who last insulted or flattered you. Machiavelli's target was specific enough to survive 40 years, 3 different ruling regimes, imprisonment, poverty, and his own death, because it was never tied to how any given day happened to feel. Most people who say they want to rebuild have not actually set coordinates at all. They have set a mood they are chasing. And a mood, unlike a fixed point on a map, cannot be corrected back toward, because it was never anchored anywhere to begin with. So here is where all 7 of these mechanisms actually land. Collapse is not the opposite of power. For a specific kind of person, it is the precondition for it, but only for the person who stops treating the wreckage as a permanent identity and starts treating it as raw material with a use. Machiavelli did not become dangerous despite the exile. He became dangerous inside it, using nothing but a farmhouse, a change of clothes, and 4 disciplined hours a night. The fact of what happened to you is real, and it deserves to be looked at honestly. The label the world hands you afterward is optional, and most people wear it far longer than they were ever required to. Which of these 7 mechanisms is the one you are currently avoiding? Not the one that sounds most appealing to talk about in the comments. The one you already know applies to you and have been quietly putting off. Say it plainly below, because naming it is the first correction back toward the coordinates. And if the fact versus label distinction from early in this video is the one still sitting with you, go back and mark that timestamp now, before the next video in this feed pulls your attention somewhere else entirely.